In 1980, a director was arrested, and it wasn't because of his crime in his film, for a crime they thought he actually committed. Italian authorities believed Ruggero Deodato has murdered his own actors on camera. They made him produce the cast alive in court, just to prove they hadn't been killed for entertainment. That's not a marketing plan. That's a real legal procedure about a real film that we're going to talk about today. I'm Dr. Nika. Welcome to the Dominion. And I need you to answer something before we start. What does it mean when a country's cinema gets so convincing, so committed to realism, that the state assumes it's watching an actual crime? Because that's Italy. That's what Italian horror did to the legal system in the 20th century. And today, we're going through a full masterclass from disturbing to genuinely, historically, legally unprecedented, of the films that came out of the country that turned horror into something closer to forensic evidence and entertainment. This isn't a list. This is an autopsy of a national cinema. Stay with me. Let's go to Italy. Before the countdown, context, because Italian horror doesn't come from the same place as American horror, and it definitely doesn't come from the same place as the French cinema we covered previously. Here's the thing about Italy in the late 20th century that I need you to understand. This is a country that lived through actual fascism, real fascism, Mussolini, state violence as official policy, and then, in the post-war decades, it lived through something almost as destabilizing. The years it led, anni di piombo, decades of domestic terrorism, political assassinations, kidnappings, bombings carried out by both far-left and far-right groups, with a death toll that ran into the hundreds and level of public paranoia that meant ordinary Italians generally didn't know on any given day whether the news was reporting truth or stage provocation. I want you to sit with that for a second. I say that a lot because for the single most important fact to understand everything we're about to watch, Italian audiences in the 1970s had lived through a period where the government itself was suspected of staging terrorist attacks to manipulate public opinion, where you couldn't trust the footage on the evening news, where reality itself had become manipulated, theatrical thing. So when Italian directors started making films that blurred the lines between fiction and documentary, when they started asking, is this real or staged, as the central anxiety of their horror, they weren't being edgy for edge's sake. They were making the only kind of horror that made sense to an audience that had already lived through a decade of not knowing what was real. There's also the influence of Catholicism, and I don't mean that lightly. Italy is the seat of the Vatican. The entire visual language of Italian horror is steeped into religion, iconography, martyrdom, sin, confession, the body as a site of the most sacred and the profound meaning. You'll see this over and over today. Italian horror doesn't just hurt bodies, it venerates them while hurting them. It frames violence with the same visual that church uses for the same. And then there's giallo, the genre that gave Italian horror its visual signature, stylish, hyper-aestheticized murder mysteries with black glove killers, blurred colors, and a camera that lingers on violence the way a painter lingers on a still life. Giallo turned murder into art direction. And once you've turned murder into art direction, the next step, turning real ethical transgression into art, isn't actually that far. That's your frame. Political paranoia, religious iconography, aestheticized death. Let's go to the countdown. Entry 10. We start with a film most of you have probably already seen. Because Dario Argento's Suspiria has become one of the most influential horror films in the world. But I want you to understand why it belongs in the bottom of this list, not the top. It's because compared to everything else we're discussing today, it's almost gentle. Almost. 1977. A young American ballet student, Susie, arrives at a prestigious dance academy in Fiverr, Germany during a thunderstorm. Strange deaths start happening. The school, we slowly learn, is run by a covenant of witches. What makes Suspiria disturbing isn't the gore. Um, the kill sequences, when they come, is extraordinarily graphic for their era. It's the sensory assault. Argento built this film like an operatic fever dream. Oversaturated primary colors, a deafening score by the band Goblin that Argento played live on set, and deliberately uncomfortable volumes so the actors' fear would be real. Sets painted in colors during that doesn't exist in real interior design. He wanted the film to feel like being trapped inside a fairy tale that's been poisoned. Here's the clinical layer. Suspiria is one of the most accurate cinematic depictions of what we now understand as institutional grooming environments. A beautiful, prestigious, tightly controlled space, students isolated from outside contact, strange rules that no one questions, authority figures who are simultaneously nurturing and sinister. Susie spends the entire film slowly realizing that the institution she trusted to develop her talent is actually consuming her. That's not just witch coven horror. That's the architecture of every documented cult and institutional abuse cases we have on record. The slow, disorienting realization that a place that promised to make you better was built to use you. Argento said he wanted the film to feel the way a child experiences a fairy tale, pure, vivid, and not yet protected by adult rationalization. That's exactly why it works on you the way it does. Dread scale? 6 out of 10. The least bloody entry on this list, and still one of the most influential horror films ever made. Number 9 takes us to Lucio Fulci, the director Italians nicknamed the Godfather of Gore. And if Argento made horror that felt like a fairy tale, Fulci made horror that felt like a wound that wouldn't close. The Beyond, 1981. A woman inherits a hotel in Louisiana and unaware that the previous owner, an artist who was crucified and dissolved in quicklime by an angry mob decades earlier, set events in motion that are about to reopen that gate. The plot, frankly, doesn't matter. Critics have said that for decades. Fulci wasn't interested in narrative logic. He was interested in something closer to pure dream image. Sequences of surreal urological horror strung together with hallucinatory internal consistency that mimics nightmare structure more than waking narrative. What earns this a spot on the list is the eyes. Fulci had an obsession across his entire films with ocular drama. Eyes gouged, eyes pierced, dissolved by acid. The Beyond contains some of the most viscerally upsetting eye trauma sequences in cinema history. And it's not incidental. Fulci was making a specific argument that horror cinema's job is to violate the audience's primary organ of consumption. You watch horror with your eyes. Fulci wanted you to feel that vulnerability directly, to make the audience's own instrument of spectatorship the very thing being destroyed on screen. That's a genuinely sophisticated piece of directorial intent disguised as B-movie gore, and it's exactly the kind of thing that makes Italian horror from this era so much richer than its reputation suggests. Tread scale, 7 out of 10, less narratively coherent than anything else on this list. More pure, infinitely physically upsetting than almost all of them. Entry 8, The New York Ripper, 1982. Number 8 is a film that got Fulci's passport flagged. Literally. The New York Ripper was so controversial that Fulci has said customs officials in multiple countries treated him differently once they recognized his name. A serial killer is murdering women across New York City. He taunts police with a voice that sounds like, deliberately, exactly like Donald Duck. A detective races to catch him before the killings escalate. I want to be very direct about why this film is controversial, because it's important to the analysis. The misogyny in this film isn't subtext, it's text. The murders are explicitly prolonged and specifically eroticized in a way that many critics at that time and since have argued crosses from horror to violent pornography and aimed specifically at women's bodies. The British Board of Film Classification refused to certify it for years. It was prosecuted under obscenity law in the UK. It remains to this day one of the most ethically contested films in the giallo canon. Here's why I'm including it and how I want you to think about it clinically. The New York Ripper is useful, and it's not because it's good. It is a diagnostic specimen. It shows you with total clarity what happens when the giallo genre's aestheticization of violence against women is stripped of any of its artistic ambiguity, social commentary, or formal sophistication that elevates films like Suspiria or even Deep Red. This is what's left when you remove everything except the violence and the gaze. Fulci himself later in life expressed conflicted feelings about it, and I think that conflict is the correct response. Some entries on this list like this exist, it's not because they're masterpieces. It's, I want you to understand extreme cinema requires its failures and not just success. Dread scale 8 out of 10. Number 7 brings us back to Argento, but in a completely different register. And this one's personal for him in a way that makes the film genuinely unsettling on a other level. Tenebrae, 1982. An American mystery novelist arrives in Rome to promote his latest book, Tenebrae, and a killer begins to murder people of the exact style described in his fiction. The novelist becomes both the suspect and the target, told in a murder mystery that seems to be quoting his own work back at him in blood. Argento made this film after he received a lot of death threats and accusations that his earlier work, specifically the extreme violence in films like Suspiria and Deep Red, was directly inspiring real violence against women. Tenebrae is Argento's response, and it's genuinely uncomfortable one, because instead of refuting the accusations, he leans directly into it. The film is, on some level, Argento interrogating his own complicity as an artist, asking whether a person who makes violent fiction their responsibility for the violence it might inspire in someone unstable enough to act on it. The film's climactic reveal, which I won't fully spoil, involves a character whose psychology has been shaped by an active sexual humiliation and adolescence, which hurtled over decades into a specific ritualized form of violence. This is, clinically, a reasonably accurate, if heightened for cinema, depiction of how early sexual trauma and humiliation can, in rare and extreme cases, become organized into adult ritualistic violence. The kind of case study you'd find in a far less stylized form in forensic psychology literature on offender pathology. What makes Tenebrae land harder than a typical giallo is that Argento isn't hiding behind metaphor. He's asking the audience directly. If you've enjoyed everything I've shown you so far in my career, what does that make you? Dread scale, 7.5 out of 10. The most self-aware film on this list. Number 6, and we're staying with Argento one more time, because I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't include the film most critics consider his actual masterpiece, even above Suspiria. Deep Red, Profondo Rosso, 1975. A jazz pianist witnesses the murder of his psychic through her apartment window and becomes obsessed with solving the case himself, pulling on a thread that leads back through decades of buried family trauma to a killer whose identity, when revealed, reconstructs the entire film. Here's why this belongs higher than the more famous Suspiria. The part that makes this film genuinely psychological bridge is the central reveal about the killer's origin, which involves a childhood trauma so specific and so carefully constructed that I won't spoil it, except to say this. Argento is making an argument here about the difference between witnessing trauma and inheriting it, about how violence experienced, even violence committed by someone else in your presence when you were a child, can become encoded into developing psyche in ways that surface decades later, dressed in completely different behavior. This maps onto something that trauma literature calls vicarious traumatization in early development, the well-documented phenomenon where children who witness extreme violence, even when they themselves aren't the direct victims, develop trauma responses, in rare cases, organize their entire adult personality around managing or reenacting what they saw. Argento called this his most personal film. You can feel why. Dread scale, 8 out of 10. I want to pause here because we're about to cross into territory that's categorically different from everything we've discussed so far. Everything in the bottom half of this list, Argento, FULCI, operates with a recognizable horror grammar, stylized by violence, heightened reality, a camera that announces in every frame, this is cinema, this is constructed, this is art. What's coming next breaks that contract entirely. Here's the psychological shift I need you to make. The films in our top 5 were specifically designed to make audiences doubt what they were watching was real. Not metaphorically real, literally, legally, factually real. And that's not an accident of low-budget filmmaking. It was the explicit, stated goal of the directors who made them. Why would a filmmaker want that? Why would you deliberately engineer your own audiences and uncertainty whether they're watching a documentary or fiction? Because, and this goes back to what I told you before about the years that led, Italian audiences in this period had already lost their certainty about reality. The news lied, the government staged things. The line between authentic footage and manufactured propaganda had already dissolved in the national consciousness before these directors ever picked up a camera. So when Italian horror directors made films that look real, that use real documentary techniques, and incorporated real footage of real death, they weren't inventing a new kind of dishonesty. They were reflecting a society that already learned not to trust its own eyes. And in doing so, they created cinemas so convincing that the legal system itself couldn't tell fiction from evidence. That's what we're walking into now. Entry 5, The House on the Edge of the Park, 1980. And now we're in Ruggero Deodato's territory, the director whose work will dominate the rest of this list, for reasons that will become very clear very quickly. Shot in 3 weeks, immediately after Deodato wrapped his most notorious film, which we'll get to, a mechanic named Alex and his simple-minded friend Ricky are invited to a party at a wealthy villa by a couple whose car they fixed. What starts as class tension and social humiliation hurdles almost immediately into one of the most extended sequences of sustained sexual violence and psychological torment in the genre's history. David Hess plays Alex, and if that name means nothing to you, here's the context that makes this film land differently. Hess had already played the most notorious villain in American exploitation horror, Croup, in Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. Deodato cast him here knowing exactly what audiences would bring into the theater. Hess's entire performance trains on the audience's pre-existing terror of him. The film is, structurally, a class war horror story. Alex and Ricky are working class men, mocked and condescended by a group of wealthy partygoers who treat their presence as a novelty, as amusement, until the mockery tips Alex into violence. The film spends its first act letting you watch the rich characters being genuinely cruel, and spends its second and third acts making you watch what happens when that cruelty is repaid with interest, and then repaid again in a spiral that long outlasts any reasonable definition of proportional response. This is, clinically, one of the most accurate cinematic depictions of what's called humiliation-triggered escalatory violence, a documented pattern in forensic psychology where an initial act of social humiliation, particularly one that activates pre-existing class or status shame, produces a violent response disproportionate by triggering events because it's not actually responding to the event. It's responding to every accumulated humiliation making before it. The film was so violent it landed on the UK's official video nasties list and required over 11 minutes of cuts for legal release. Deodato himself said when he first read the script, "I make violent films, but softer ones. This film was full of violence, and that made me uncomfortable." When the director of Cannibal Holocaust tells you a script made him uncomfortable, that should tell you something. Dread scale, 8.5 out of 10. Entry 4, Cannibal FEROX. Thank you, Lane79. I saw this recently, so maybe that's why it's 2. And we move into the cannibal boom, a uniquely Italian exploitation subgenre that emerged in the 1970s and 80s. And then I need to contextualize honestly before we go further, because it carries a real ethical weight that I don't want to gloss over. Cannibal FEROX, 1981. Directed by Umberto Lenzi, also released as Make Them Die Slowly. An anthropology graduate student travels to the Amazon to prove that cannibalism is a colonial myth invented by Western imperialists to justify the conquest and exploitation of indigenous people. And instead, he encounters a group of escaped criminals who've been torturing, exploiting, and murdering the local indigenous population, provoking a violent retaliation. I want to be honest about what this subgenre is and isn't. The Cannibal Boone films in this era were deeply, inescapably tangled up in colonial racism. They trade on the savage native trope that's been used for centuries to humanize indigenous and non-Western peoples. And several of these productions involve real, on-camera killing of actual animals, which remains one of the most legitimate and serious criticisms levied against the entire subgenre. What makes Cannibal FEROX specifically worth discussing, beyond its reputation as one of the most graphically violent films ever banned in multiple countries, is that it's also somewhat awkwardly in direct conversation with its own colonial premise. The film's plot explicitly sets up the argument that cannibalism is a colonial fiction, and then complicates that argument by showing indigenous violence as a direct, comprehensible response to Western brutality, rather than as an inherent savagery. It's deeply imperfect, often contradictory film, but it's not making the argument that its reputation suggests. It's trying to indict the Western gaze that created the cannibal myth in the first place. A notorious sequence involving a character's brain that was partially consumed remains one of the most graphically unsimulated looking effects in the genre's history, and it's frequently cited on the most disturbing scenes ever filmed list. Clinically, what I find most interesting about the entire cannibal subgenre is what it reveals about the audience and not the filmmakers. These films were marketed and consumed specifically because of uncertainty about the authenticity. Audiences went in not entirely sure that they were watching stage violence or something closer to documentary atrocity. That uncertainty, that specific marketed ambiguity about whether you're watching something real, is a psychological phenomenon that, in itself, it's the direct bridge to our final two entries. Dread scale, 9 out of 10. Entry 3, Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. And this is the film that got its own director arrested for murder, Ruggero Deodato. The plot: an anthropology professor leads a rescue mission into the Amazon rainforest to find a documentary film crew that disappeared while shooting a film about indigenous tribes. He finds the remains and recovers their footage. The second half of Cannibal Holocaust is that recovered footage, the missing crew's own documentary, showing them staging violence for the camera, abusing and exploiting the people they claim to be documenting, and ultimately being killed by the very tribe they spent this film degrading. DARIO invented the found footage genre with this film, decades before the Blair Witch Project made it mainstream, and the realism in his effects work was so convincing that after the film's release, Italian prosecutors opened an actual murder investigation. Deodato was required to produce his actors alive in person in court to prove that the deaths depicted on screen were special effects, not documented murders. Here's the part that doesn't get discussed enough. The film's actual thesis is a direct critique of mondo cinema, the real, then popular Italian documentary genre that exploited footage of real death, real violence, and real cultural practices from around the world for shock and entertainment, frequently staging authentic footage while marketing it as real. Deodato was making a film about media exploitation, about Western filmmakers who traveled to primitive places to manufacture sensational footage and call it truth. The film's final line, spoken by the professor as he leaves the network that wants to broadcast the recovered footage, is, "I wonder who the real cannibals are." That's the thesis. The Western media machine that consumes and stages and profits from violence against vulnerable people, while calling the people that exploits savages. I need to be completely direct about the ethical costs about this film because it's real and serious. Animals were actually killed on camera during production, a fact that remains the single most legitimate, unresolved criticism of this movie, and one that several cast members protested during filmmaking, with lead actor Robert walking off set in objection. Clinically, what makes Cannibal Holocaust so uniquely disturbing isn't any single scene, it's the structural device. By presenting you found footage of documentary filmmakers staging atrocity for entertainment, then having you realize that you're watching a real atrocity dressed as commentary on stage atrocity, Deodato collapses the protective distance our cinema usually offers. You can't locate the safe boundaries between critique and exploitation because the film is making its critique using the exact tools of the exploitation it's critiquing. It indicts you for watching while simultaneously being the thing you're being indicted for watching. That's not a flaw. That's the most sophisticated piece of formal horror construction in the entire Italian canon. And it's also why this film remains banned or restricted in numerous countries to this day. Dread scale 9.5 out of 10. Entry 2. The Years of Lead Made Flesh. A special entry. Before number 1, I want to give you something slightly different. Not a single film, but a category, because it deserves its own placement in this countdown. And I think you'll understand why once I explain it. Italian giallo and poliziotesco cinema throughout the 1970s repeatedly returned to one specific real-world horror, the Anni di Piombo, the Years of Lead, Italy's domestic terrorism crisis. Films like The Killer is Still Among Us, inspired directly by the real, still officially unsolved crimes of the monster of Florence serial killer, blurred procedural crime drama with horror in ways that genuinely terrified Italian audiences because the killer in the film and the killer in the headlines were functionally the same cultural object. What makes this category so disturbing, clinically, is the temporal proximity. These weren't period pieces processing historical trauma from a safe distance. Italian audiences in 1986 watched a film about an unsolved serial killer, while that serial killer was still, as far as anyone in Italy knew, actively at large. And that's scary. The Monster of Florence case wasn't closed until decades later and remains contested even now. Watching horror cinema about an ongoing, unsolved, real atrocity produces a specific psychological effect that fictional horror simply can't replicate. What trauma researchers sometimes called ambient dread, a low-grade, chronic activation of threat response, produced not by a single triggering event. It was sustained unresolved uncertainty in the environment. This is, I'd argue, the truest expression of everything Italian extreme cinema was built on. It wasn't for shock for its own sake, a society processing the fact that it didn't know who the monster actually was, because the monster might still be sitting next to you in the theater. Dread scale? 9 out of 10 for the entire mode. Not a single film. Entry 1. SALÒ, or the 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. And here we are. Number 1. The film that ends this list because there's nowhere left to go after it. SALÒ, Pier Paolo Pasolini's final film, released 3 weeks after his own brutal, unsolved murder. Pasolini was found beaten to death on the outskirts of Rome, officially attributed to a young male prostitute, though many historians and investigators had argued for decades that the circumstances suggest a politically motivated assassination. He never saw his own final film released. The film transposes the Marquis de Sade's notorious 18th century novel, The 120 Days of Sodom, into Mussolini's last fascist stronghold, the Republic of SALÒ, 1944 and 1945. The dying days of Italian fascism. 4 wealthy, powerful libertines, a duke, a bishop, a magistrate, and a president, kidnap 18 teenagers and subject them to 4 months of escalating sexual violence, physical torture, and total psychological degradation, structured explicitly around the 4 circles of Dante's Inferno. The Dante's Inferno, the circle of manias, the circle of shit, and the circle of blood. I'm not going to describe the film's content in detail. Of course I can't. I'll tell you only this. It includes forced coprophagia, systematic sexual torture, and a closing sequence of ritualized executions viewed through binoculars by the perpetrators, who take turns watching each other's atrocities as a form of shared aesthetic pleasure. It remains banned in some parts in some countries till this day. It was banned in Italy itself within 2 months of release. Here's what almost no one tells you about SALÒ, and what makes it categorically different from everything else on this list. It's not, despite every surface appearance, a film about sexual violence. Pasolini was one of the most serious intellectuals to ever work in cinema. A poet, a novelist, Marxist theorist, a deeply engaged political philosopher. He said directly that this was his first film about the modern world, and what he meant was this: the four libertines in SALÒ represent total, unaccountable institutional power: the church, the state, the judiciary, and the inherited wealth, operating with absolute impunity over bodies that have no power to refuse. He wasn't making a film about fascism in 1944. He was making a film about what he saw happening in consumer capitalism in 1975, and using historical fascism as the only frame extreme enough to make the comparison legible. Pasolini's argument, and it's one that film scholars have spent 50 years unpacking, is that consumerism does to the human body and human desire exactly what the libertines in this film do. It commodifies, exploits, and ultimately discards human beings for the pleasure and profit of those holding power, while wrapping the entire process in a language of choice and participation. The victims in SALÓ are told repeatedly that what's happening to them is for their own good, that they should be grateful for the intention, that their suffering serves a higher purpose. That rhetorical structure, power dressed as care, is Pasolini identical to the rhetorical structure of consumer capitalism's relationship to the people it exploits. Clinically, what SALÓ depicts with unmatched precision is the complete operational and anatomy of institutional sadism, enabled by total impunity, every documented psychological mechanism, the dehumanization of victims through ritualized renaming and nudity, the use of confession and forced complicity to fracture solidarity among victims, the systematic destruction of any external reference point that could remind victims of their prior selves, and the perpetrators' use of aesthetic and intellectual language to distance themselves from the moral weight of what they're doing. This is, in clinical terms, the most complete cinematic catalog of the psychology of organized atrocity ever produced, more thorough in some respects than historical documentation of the actual camps and actual fascist violence it's drawing from, because Pasolini built in it as an enclosed total system with nothing left outside the frame to look away to. He didn't live to defend it. He didn't live to see how it be received, debated, banned, rediscovered, and eventually canonized by the Criterion Collection as a masterpiece. The Roman tabloids ran his murdered, disfigured body on their front pages within days of finishing this film, and there are critics who noted with real unease that the iconography of his own death echoes the iconography of what he put on screen. I don't think SALÓ is a film most people should watch, because it's a hard watch. It is a masterpiece, though. But I also think it's the most intellectually, seriously extreme films ever made by anyone, anywhere. And if you want to understand what Italian cinema was capable of, when it pointed its full intelligence, its full formal sophistication, and its full historical trauma at a single unbearable target. This is the answer. Dread scale. There's no scale for this. This is where the scale was invented and also where it ends. 10 entries. A country that lived through real fascism, real terrorism, real uncertainty about what was true, and turned all of it into cinema so convincing that courts couldn't tell fiction from murder. Here's what I want you to leave you with. Every film on this list, in its own way, asks the same question Italy itself was asking throughout the half of the 20th century. Who do you trust when the people in power are the ones doing the harming? The witches running the dance academy, the wealthy partygoers humiliating the working class, the documentary crew staging atrocity for readings, the duke, the bishop, the magistrate, and the president, power's four faces, operating with total impunity behind closed doors. That's not exploitation for its own sake. That's a country that lived through real impunity, making art about what it actually looks like from the inside. I want to know, out of everything we've covered today, which one is staying with you? And not don't tell me the goriest, tell me the one that actually is going to sit on your chest. Tell me in the comments. I read everything. And if you're still here, if you made it through this entire masterclass, you already know what this channel is. You already know we don't look away in here. I'll end this quickly. I just have to say, for my Dominion family and any viewer that just watches my videos, thank you. I'm just here putting my two passions, psychology and horror, and maybe in the future I'll expand from horror to other genres. I create the space just to talk about my passion, and I found great friends along the way, a Dominion family. And if you want to go deeper to see what lies behind the dark mind, join the Dominion.